Exercise 13. Inventors of the airplane. Now listen to the first part of the talk about the inventors of the airplane. As you listen to the talk, write down the missing information in the notes below.
The first successful trip men made through the air was in a balloon. The next step was to make the balloon go where they wanted it to go. This they did by adding motors and propellers. The result was the airship. But still, men were not satisfied. They wanted to build a machine that would fly through the air on wings. Such a machine is called an airplane. Many people in Europe and in America worked on this concept. The first inventors to build an airplane in which a man could fly were Wilbur and Orville Wright. Wilbur was born in 1867 near Millville, Indiana. Orville Wright was born 4 years later. When the two brothers grew up, they built up a successful printing business and soon opened a bicycle shop. One day, Wilbur read of a man in Germany who had fallen to his death while flying in a glider. A glider is really a kite that is large enough to carry a man. The idea of flying in a glider immediately interested Wilbur Wright. He told Orville about it. Then he began looking through the books in his father's library. One of the books which he found helpful was a book on birds. Man was imitating the birds when he was attempting to fly. The two brothers carefully watched and studied the flight of birds. They noticed how some birds could coast through the air for long periods of time. They found that other people, both in America and in Europe, had been trying to fly. These people had built gliders too. There was one question no one had answered. That was how to balance the glider when it began to dip forward or backward or to one side. The Wright brothers, after long study, decided to build a pair of smaller wings before the wings of their glider. By turning these smaller wings up or down, the glider would not dip forward or backward too far. For 4 years, the Wright brothers studied and worked on this problem. At last, they were ready to build a glider of their own. In the fall of the year 1900, the Wright brothers built their first glider at Kitty Hawk, and the test flight was a success.
Exercise 14. Inventors of the airplane. Now listen to the second part of the talk about the inventors of the airplane and fill in the missing information in the notes below.
The Wright brothers started to improve their glider, paying particular attention to its controls and to the shape of the wings. The new glider was longer and had a tail, but they wanted to add power to their glider. The following year, their bicycle shop seemed more like an airplane shop. Orville designed an engine which they built and mounted on the glider to produce flying power. They also experimented with various designs for the all-important propellers. It was December when the Wright brothers' plane was ready for the flight. Orville climbed into the plane and started the motor. Wilbur was holding the end of one of the wings to keep the plane level. Slowly, the plane started forward. It gained speed and rose into the air. It moved swiftly upward, then downward, then upward again. It was not a smooth ride, but it was successful. The plane came down undamaged, 120 feet from where it had started. 3 more flights were made that day. The longest was 852 feet, and the time in the air was 59 seconds. It was not a remarkable record, but it showed the Wright brothers that their plane was successful. Man had actually flown in an airplane. This was the beginning of the importance of the airplane. In 1912, after a few years of success, Wilbur died of typhoid fever when he was only 45. In 1943, exactly 40 years after the Wright brothers' first flights, Orville agreed to give their first airplane to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. On January 30th, 1948, Orville died at the age of 77 after a short illness. The Wright brothers will never be forgotten. The names of both brothers are firmly and forever linked in the history of aviation. Exercise 15. Invention of the telegraph. Listen to the first part of the talk about the invention of the telegraph. As you listen, circle the correct letter for questions 1 to 3, and then fill in the missing information in the notes for questions 4 to 14.
Today it takes only a short time to send a message to the most distant parts of the world. The man who made this possible was Samuel F.B. Morse. His invention was the telegraph. Morse was not only a great inventor, he was also one of the best early American portrait painters. He gave up painting to give all his time to his invention. Then he set out to show how useful it was. After a long struggle, he succeeded. He lived long enough to see his telegraph span the United States and connect Europe with the United States. Samuel F.B. Morse was born in Massachusetts in 1791. When he was 14, he entered Yale College. He was a very good student in electricity, but he was more interested in painting and drawing. He wanted to be an artist. He was a successful painter and won several medals and prizes. On one trip to the United States, he had an interesting idea. Later, this idea developed into his famous invention. Some of the other people on the boat were talking about the speed with which electricity can travel over a wire. Morse thought that it might be possible to use electricity to send a message over a wire. This message, he thought, could be recorded at the other end. A message could then be sent with the speed of electricity. Before the end of the trip, Morse had drawn up rough plans for an instrument. He called it the electric or magnetic telegraph. Morse began to work out his idea as soon as he landed. He gave up his work as a painter. Instead, he chose to work on his new idea. Almost 5 years later, his experiments were successful. He built an instrument that made his idea work.
Exercise 16. Invention of the telegraph. Listen to the second part of the talk and complete the notes below.
Samuel Morse set up his telegraph in a room at the university. People came to see it, but they could not believe that it would ever be more than a toy. Morse needed more money to build a telegraph over a distance. He could never prove what it could do if it was just set up in one room. but it was very expensive to build a telegraph line over a distance. Morse asked Congress to give him $30,000 for such a line. But many people in Congress laughed at his idea, so he didn't get the money. Morse struggled on, hoping that someday he could prove the value of his invention. He went to several European countries to try to get them to use the telegraph there, but European governments didn't want to have anything to do with his wild idea. He returned to America sad and without money. When he asked Congress for the money again this time, Congress granted him $30,000. As soon as he got the money, Morse built a telegraph line from Washington to Baltimore, a distance of about 40 miles. At first, he tried to lay his wires underground, but that did not work well. So, he decided to nail the wires to poles. Finally, the line was ready for the first test. One day in 1844, after 12 years of work, Morse stood at Washington with a group of friends. He was ready to send the first telegraph message. Another group was in Baltimore, ready to receive it. The message went through clearly. From then on, people believed in the telegraph. Soon poles and wires were spread over the United States. Then cables were laid under the oceans, and telegraph service was in use all over the world.